Hello, my name is Bob Ferris, and I'm the Executive Director of Resources for Sustainable Communities here in Bellingham, Washington. And I'm the leader of a coalition of organizations that are fighting a coal terminal at Cherry Point, just north of our city here. The coalition includes groups like Sierra Club, 350.org, Climate Solutions, and others who are working to stop this project. I thought about coming here today. I was trying to figure out what theme I was going to go with, and what came into my mind was that whole scene that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert had at their rally for sanity in Washington, D.C., where they had Peace Train on opposite Ozzy Osbourne's train song, and then I thought, well, heck, this is actually Coal Train or Peace Train sort of decision, and I think that that's a really appropriate thing for today's audience. The other thing I will say is that this is a local issue. This is a local issue. This is a regional issue. This is a state issue. It's a federal issue, and it's a global issue. And your access point on this issue depends on where you live and how close you are to this facility. So I'll try and address everybody's issues, but that's kind of difficult based upon the scale and the complexity of this issue. So what are we talking about? The project that's under discussion at this point at Cherry Point is a coal export terminal that will ship coal to China from the northwestern corner of the United States. We're looking at 48 million metric tons of coal a year. That if you use the English system where you're using short tons, just take that and multiply it by 1.1, and the number comes out to 54 million, or it comes out to 52 million metric tons. This is going to be a multi-purpose terminal, and they're planning ultimately to ship 54 million metric tons out of there. For us here in Bellingham, that means 26 to 30 miles of new trains a day. That will close off our at-grade crossings about 5 to 8 minutes every hour. And when we look at the number of trains, I mean, it's hard to describe the scale of this project to people, but this means an additional, and we already have train traffic already, this means an additional around 27,000 trains passing through the city each and every day. For us, the regulations here are that they have to have 5 horn blasts for every at-grade crossing, so 24 hours a day, that's 90 horn blasts per crossing per day, 24/7. A lot of people talk about the advantages of shipping by rail, and there are a lot of advantages to shipping by rail. One is fuel efficiency, but one of the things that's a challenge, and is always going to be a challenge, is that even though there is fuel efficiency, when you look at particulate emissions, and those are the things that cause cancer, cause respiratory disease, and cause a whole lot of other lung and heart-related ailments, those, when you look at how much is emitted per ton of material shipped, for semis and trains, it's pretty equal. So to get an idea of the scale of this project and the impact through heavily settled areas in this region, we're talking about the equivalent of 2.6 to 2.8 million semi-tractor trailers running through an area annually. So that works out to the equivalent of one about every 12 seconds. So who's trying to build this facility? So the involved players here are SSA Marine, who's the lead company here, and 49% of that company is owned by Goldman Sachs. Peabody Coal, a large coal company, Peabody Energy, and then Burlington Northern, which is owned by Warren Buffett. So large companies run by people who are already rich. When I look at this equation here, and this equation to us is being sold based on a few jobs up there and some, I will call them quote tax revenues, I think the thing that we really need to focus on here is how much is going to be made by these three corporations in here. And the figures that I have here are increases in projected increases in annual revenues that they'll realize from this project when it's operating at full capacity. SSA Marine will probably take in an additional $540 million a year from this project. Burlington Northern, somewhere around $750 million a year. And Peabody Coal, depending upon the coal price, will probably get increased revenues anywhere from $2.5 to $5.8 billion a year when this is running at full capacity. I'm going to talk about impacts here, but one of the things that I want to start with is looking at those rural areas. And I've worked in rural areas over the years on some pretty complicated issues. This matrix here on this slide is a representation of how farm subsidies and federal farm policy affect rural areas. And I guess the key message that I want to portray here is that things that affect rural areas are generally complicated and they're not always obvious. We put this matrix together so that people could understand, you know, if you were a conservationist, how agricultural policy affected your issues, if you're a family farmer, how it affects your issues and all that. But after looking at this and analyzing this sort of issue in rural areas, I came up with kind of a generalization. And the generalization is this, is what happens when rural America collides with corporate America? And the answer to that, in almost every instance, is that rural America gets screwed. And I think that that's one of the things, because this train runs just in Washington State, 624 miles through the state, through populated areas, but also rural areas that have little voice to oppose these sorts of issues. So what sorts of impacts do we expect to have happen? I think first and foremost we look at health impacts, and that and those include increased heart attack risk, increased cancer risks, more mercury in the water, and I just read a statistic the other day that said 1 out of 6 pregnant women in the United States have enough mercury in their bodies at this point to cause a birth defect. And I wonder, you know, given that, why we would run any risk of adding to that burden. And then there's the one that gets discounted, but it's very real to those of us that live near the tracks, is the whole sleep deprivation thing. This project, coupled with other existing train traffic, is going to mean that there is going to be a train coming through about every 45 minutes. So if you live near an at-grade crossing, you're going to hear, you know, 5 horn blasts every 45 minutes, 24 hours a day, which in our instance, my wife and I, that generally wakes us up when that happens. There are also a lot of economic impacts here. For people who live along the tracks, we're expecting to see low property values. Small businesses are going to be impacted because people have a tendency to frequent businesses that are easy to get to. And if you've got a restaurant that's your favorite restaurant and it's on the wrong side of the tracks here, and if you're blocked 2 or 3 times, that ceases to become your favorite restaurant. And those economic impacts, when multiplied along the entire 624-mile route through some of the most populated areas in Washington State, become a non-trivial sort of economic impact. And then we just talk about time. Time has always been stated as time is money. And if you're stuck at a train stop waiting for a 1.5 mile long coal train to go by, which could take, you know, 5 to 8 minutes, that's a non-trivial amount of time. And then the last one, and possibly the largest one that we're looking at here, is the massive public investment that has to happen to allow this project to move forward. Each and every city that has an at-grade crossing where there are going to be either safety issues or unworkable traffic issues, those improvements, those overpasses, those safety crosses, 90% of that cost has to be borne by the taxpayer under current federal law. The railroads were very successful in getting that sort of legislation put in there, that if anything, you know, their right-of-way is their right-of-way, and they can do whatever they want there, and if we need to get across it, that's our problem, not their problem. And a lot of areas are going to also suffer from agricultural impacts. And that means that, you know, poor Bessie out there that is about to be milked, we're going to see lower milk production in cows because of noise issues. We've also seen studies that indicate that there's stunted growth in chickens, slowed plant growth because of either coal dust, and there's a thing when diesel particulates and coal dust get together, they get this kind of gluey stuff that sticks to plants, which just from displacing green spots on plants has an impact on their growth rate. And then there's, you know, people grow crops so that they look good and they're marketable, and if they've got spots all over them, that's not something that helps their marketability. Here in Washington State and other areas with a lot of marine sorts of industries, particularly nearshore aquaculture, coal dust and waterways. Coal dust has metal in it. It's also organic, which means that it draws oxygen out of the water. A lot of these habitats are warm water habitats to a certain extent because they're shallow and near shore. Anytime you start taking oxygen out of those habitats, it's going to affect the life in there. The diesel particulates also have a lot of toxic materials in there that affect not only growth but birth defects and other mutations in nearshore organisms. With the coal being shipped to China and burned, that's another 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. If you have been reading National Geographic lately, you'll know that they had an article recently on ocean acidification, and that's a big issue that's stunting growth and doing a lot of damage to shell fisheries and that sort of thing because they can't accumulate shell mass. And then there's just climate change, altering rain patterns, and if rain comes at the wrong time, things like salmon runs happen or don't happen because of that sort of thing. If you look out there and you see a piece of water and think that salmon are going to swim through it and it's 2 or 3 degrees higher than is acceptable to them and there's not enough dissolved oxygen there, they won't swim through there, and it's a thing called a thermal dam. We won't see it, but they will. So those are some of the nearshore marine impacts that we expect.